Hello, everyone. Hello. We're gonna get started in just a minute or so. Um, I'm Carter Lavin with Transbay Coalition, one of your hosts for this evening. This is a real treat for us all as part of this big Bay Area and SoCal Transit Month adventure. So we'll start talking in a second. Um, Little last bit of housekeeping. Dylan, I realize while I have the slides up, do you mind being welcoming people into the room button person?
Oh, yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. And so with that, let me kick things off for the crew. Hello, everyone. So this is a real treat that we have here for you today as part of uh, Bay Area and Southern California Transit Month. We have a discussion and followed by a Q&A with Anna Zivarts, the author of When Driving is Not an Option, Steering Away from Car Dependency. I'm Carter Lavin. I'm with the Transbay Coalition. We're a grassroots transit advocacy group in the 9-county Bay Area. We are also putting this on in conjunction with Move LA, which is a great transportation group based in Los Angeles, and Move California, which is kind of our statewide thing. And this is all part of Transit Month. So throughout the Bay Area and Southern California and San Diego too, there is all sorts of transit events, including this, lots of other talks. So transitmonth.org gets you to the calendar of events. We have fun things like Saturday, for example, this Saturday in LA and in San Jose, we're hosting high-speed rail parties, kind of a We Love LA party, We Love the Bay Area party. So come on out, check out the calendar. And big thank you goes to Access LA for helping put this on, for making this possible. Access Paratransit operates 7 days a week, 24 hours of the day in most areas of Los Angeles County. It's a shared ride service that is curb to curb, utilizes a fleet of small buses, minivans, and taxis. Fares are distance-based and range from $275 to $350 for each one-way trip. Personal care attendants may ride with qualified rider free. Learn more at accessla.org. And of course, this wouldn't be possible without Anna Zivarts themselves. So Anna Zivarts is a low vision parent, non-driver, and author of When Driving is Not an Option, Steering Away from Car Dependency, which came out by Island Press last year in 2024. Wow, that was really, if you changed a lot of the conversation in just a year. This is like really new. Anna created Week Without Driving Challenge and is passionate about bringing the voices of non-drivers to the planning and policy-making tables. Anna sits on the boards of the League of American Bicyclists, the Pacific Northwest Transportation Consortium, and the Washington State Transportation's Innovation Council. She also serves as member of TRB's Committee on Public Health and Transportation and the National Aging and Disability Transportation Center Coordinating Committee. And so with that, I'm going to pass the proverbial microphone to Dylan Finch of Transbay Coalition, who's going to lead us in about a 40-minute or so open conversation with Anna. In the meantime, this is being recorded. Folks, please put your questions in the chat. At the very end of the webinar, we will get to them. I will read them off. So as you have questions around any of the topics coming up, please put them in the chat. And with that, I'm going to go turn off my screen and listen in on you all. So Anna and Dylan, microphone's all yours.
All right, thanks so much, Carter. Yeah, my name's Dylan Finch. I'm a volunteer with the Transbay Coalition, just helping out with various things around the Bay Area Transit and doing the book club as well for Transbay Coalition. And so, yeah, we just finished reading Anna's book here. Oh, it's a little blurred, but yeah, we just finished it and very happy. So thank you very much for being here and kind of joining this little discussion. I guess first question I'd just like to ask, like, I've never written a book before. How was your experience writing the book? It's just such a huge topic to tackle, so many little pieces of it, so many little intricacies. Like, how did you go about it?
Yeah, hi everyone, and thanks Dylan, thanks Carter, thanks for all you all being here tonight. I don't know, it's a beautiful day in Seattle, and so I'm outside. I hope you're somewhere comfortable and tuning in to this conversation. So yeah, writing a book, I did not start out life thinking I wanted to write a book. My background is actually in storytelling, but in more visual storytelling. I did video storytelling for years and years, sort of from the beginning of YouTube on through, you know, social media video. And that was my background. And then I had been doing a lot of organizing of transit riders and other non-drivers in Washington State, and had reached a point where I really wanted to figure out, how do I don't have funds to hire more people and to like get the message out that way. I spent a lot of years trying to fundraise and trying to grow the organizing capacity that way, and realized that writing a book could be a really useful tool to getting the message out in a way that to get the word out, right? To people, to hear about the work I wanted to do, to get inspired about centering the voices of non-drivers, and in particular involuntary non-drivers. And so that was how the book came along. It took a while. I had the stories already because I'd been doing the organizing, and so I knew going into it, you know, these are the people I wanted to interview, these are the stories I want to tell. But it took a little time to find a publisher, and to convince Island Press, to be honest, that this was a story worth telling, because so much of my work was Washington State based. And, you know, I'd lived in New York City for about 15 years. I'd lived in Arizona for a year. I went to school in the Bay Area. I'd lived in different parts of the country, and I knew that the stories I had collected from Washington State, these same stories existed in other places. But, you know, I think that wasn't clear to other folks, that it was going to resonate, you know, or that this was relevant to places outside of Washington State. And so it took a little time to get everyone on board and to see that there was value in this, and that there was value in these stories, and there was value in this perspective. And I think they got convinced, and got on board and really helped me pull this together. So that's the story, sort of how the writing piece happened.
Oh, nice. Yeah, and I feel like definitely reading it, I was very inspired to kind of, you know, say like things can be better. You know, we need a little bit of change. And you know, maybe do you like, have you seen any changes come? I know the book was written pretty recently, but have you seen any changes since then that you kind of feel like we're headed in the right direction?
Mm. I mean, you know, the work that led into the book was work I had started, you know, doing in Washington State before the book, you know, the organizing work. And so it has sort of a longer tail here in Washington State. And so I can speak to, you know, how bringing people to the table who hadn't previously been part of the conversation, in particular disabled folks, and low income disabled folks who, who can't drive and can't afford to drive, just aren't usually at a lot of policymaking tables. And having those voices and those people show up and explain their experiences of trying to get around their communities, I think that has really shifted the conversation here in Washington State. And I'm starting to see it really have an impact in other places too. I know other groups are already doing work like this. You know, Pittsburgh, Transit Riders Union there, you know, there's groups that are in all around the country, right? I'm sure you guys do too, like reaching out, intentionally recruiting and finding members who, you know, it's not sort of a nice to have transportation. It's a, if I don't have access, I'm not going to be able to leave my home. I don't have, you know, a social network I can always rely on. I can't afford ride hail. I can't use ride hail because I use a wheelchair, right? Like, there's people who transportation matters very, very much to, and they're not always at the table. So I think that impact is starting to trickle out around the country and around North America. Been in Canada a lot, doing work lately. The other piece that I'm really excited about that's come from this work and come from this book, and I talked about it in the book a little bit in the context of Week Without Driving, but one sort of takeaway of having elected officials sort of think about the experience of non-drivers and involuntary non-drivers is them recognizing how different their life is, right? That you know, as someone who can drive, who has relative economic security, they aren't thinking about the same things as someone who is struggling to make an appointment because the bus is late, or, you know, struggling to get to that bus stop because there's no sidewalk. And that their lives are often so far from that experience that they start to recognize that, and they also start to recognize that people with those experiences of being transit reliant aren't in the room, in these sort of, you know, in city councils, on transit boards. And so we've seen some elected officials be much more supportive of our efforts to bring voices in and actually set up governance structures here in Washington State to bring in transit rider voice and transit rider votes onto boards.
Yeah, I think that's so powerful. And I mean, do you like, what are some maybe examples of how we can better hear those voices, get those people into the room? Because I know for city council meetings and board meetings, they're often after work. You know, if you don't have, or if you don't have childcare, you know, if you have to stay late at the office, like it's just, and especially if mobility is a challenge, it's really hard to get to those meetings and have your voice heard.
Yeah, and one thing I love asking elected officials is to think about like what is transit access, right? To your the meetings that you have to be at every week. And like if you couldn't drive, could you do your job? First of all, you know, would you be taken seriously as a candidate if you didn't have the transportation to get around like a you know a private car that could get you places very quickly, right? Is it even feasible to run for elected office where you are without driving? And usually the answer is no. And then, you know, and then are those locations that you hold public meetings at that are supposedly open to the public, you know, like transit boards that meet at transit, you know, at locations that aren't accessible by transit. Like that happens, right? That happens here in Washington State. Or they meet in the evenings and, you know, maybe you could take the bus there, but the bus has stopped running by the time the transit board is over, the meeting is over. And so, you know, yeah, those are all barriers. And barriers that those are relatively easy to fix, right? Like move the meeting time, make sure that there's a bus to get people home afterwards. I mean, easy, you know, not as big and systemic as some of the other things that we need to change. Like how do we get more involuntary non-drivers into elected office? How do we actually start to, you know, change the funding priorities in our communities so that we do have reliable transit that can really connect people in the same way that driving does now.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a great point. And yeah, I mean, the week without driving thing is so incredible too, because I think it really helps people who do have a car and really have that luxury, you know, understand how challenging it can be. And I feel like, you know, having elected leaders understand that is really powerful. We're here in the Bay, we're facing like transit funding problems, and I think actually across the country there's a lot of that going on. So do you have any thoughts on that? Maybe that's something that has you a little less hopeful than you're talking about earlier.
Yeah. I mean, the funding stuff is real, and such a challenge, right? Because there was sort of this, you know, bump of funding with COVID funding, right? And now the reality of that going away and ridership being down and if not ridership, then fare collection being down in a lot of systems. That's a big area, you know, issue here in the Seattle area. And how do we fill those gaps? And you know, are we actually willing to put public funding behind transit service, not just transit capital projects, but actual transit service? I think we need to, and I think the only way we're going to get to that place is by transit rider organizing, right? Um, and becoming a powerful enough constituency that you know that can get that funding secured. So I think it's not, you know, glamorous work. A lot of people don't look at organizers as like thought leaders, and I think that's a real mistake because I think we need to recognize that there's so much more value in doing that organizing work, because without it, doesn't matter how many essay, you know, op-eds you write or articles or, you know, TED Talks, like that isn't at the end of the day what's gonna get the votes to fund get those funding priorities shifted.
Yeah, and I think one thing in your book that really stood out to me was like a third of Americans are non-drivers. Like that's a crazy big constituency.
It is, right? I mean, and that's like, it's like the number is there, right? Like a third is not some insignificant percentage. But what happens is, first of all, we like are broken up into these little groups, right? Like where we need to be thinking ourselves as a broader coalition that would benefit from a less car dependent society, right? But instead it's like, okay, well, disabled people want this thing and recent immigrants want this other thing and low income people want this and seniors need this and youth and children, you know, who aren't old enough to drive want this other thing. And then there's like, you know, the urbanists, they want this thing and the bike community. And it's like, no, let's actually try, if we're able to be in coalition with each other, which is work, right? And not always easy, but there's a lot more of us. And I think there's also like part of my message, and I message in particular to sort of urbanists and groups of folks who are more often than not choice non-drivers, right? Folks who probably could afford a car if they really wanted to, or if they, you know, wanted to live out in the suburbs where housing might be a little cheaper, they could afford a car, right? And so, you know, like the people who have chosen to be, you know, pro-transit, chosen to bike in rural places because that's a lifestyle that can work for them, recognizing that there's a lot of involuntary non-drivers too, and that those perspectives also need to be brought to the table and are a very powerful voice in this organizing, right? That there is something really compelling about making sure that the people who have the least choices, that their experience of the transportation system is also part of this advocacy, and their needs are part of the advocacy too, even if those needs might be a little different from someone who can afford to live in a really dense walkable part of a city and wants to bike places.
Yeah, that's a great point. And yeah, I feel like you really want to hear like all of those voices, because yeah, maybe what works for the choice, riders doesn't work for everyone, and you want a system that's accessible and works for all these non-drivers.
And parents, right? I mean, like that's a
Yeah.
huge one. Parents and caregivers. Like I think there is so much neglect of that perspective in active transportation and transit organizing, and as a result, like a lot of people opt into car ownership, right, when they have kids, because the system just isn't set up well in a way that works for caregivers. But it could be, like, it doesn't have to not be. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think speaking of parents, like youth is like when I grew up in a very almost exurban type of place, and we didn't even have a local bus system. So, the only way to get around was a car, and I always remember just feeling very like trapped as a kid, because and kind of as a burden, because the only way that I could get around was having my parents drive me. And so it's just crazy to me that we have this system where a huge chunk of the population, the kids, the future, is kind of left without a lot of mobility options.
Yeah. No, I mean, and young people love the freedom, right? I mean, I remember as a young person, like when you are somewhere where you're able to get around without being driven by a parent, it's wonderful. Like those times when we were on vacation and I was allowed to like bike to the store to buy candy, right? Like that was great. Um, and I think we can also, like, we can set up systems like that. I was talking to someone here in Seattle who had grown up in New York City, and he's like, gosh, I can't imagine raising kids in Seattle because I would have to drive them everywhere, which is not true, but that's what most people do here, right? Because it is a very, very car dependent community, and transit's so much slower. Um, but he's like, as growing up in New York, I had so much freedom in middle school to go anywhere I wanted to go on the subway, and that's just normalized in New York City, because that transit system is so great, and really does cover so much of the city, and so frequent and so reliable, and it's this the culture of just middle schoolers can ride it, and that's fine. Whereas here, I think I would probably have like Child Protective Services called on me if I let my fifth grader ride the public bus to school on his own and had a transfer point, even just riding the bus probably. So yeah, it's frustrating because I have a third grader now. In 2 years, I would love, 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 love for him to be able to take the bus to school, the city bus, and that's yeah, I'm not sure he's going to be able to.
Yeah, and I think it's a win for the kids. It's a win for the parents too, because it saves you don't have to be chauffeuring your kids around all the time. That gives you a huge amount of time back to go to stay at work, maintain maybe a full-time job instead of a part-time, or even just some time for yourself. Like yeah.
Yeah, no, and school busing, like the school bus system, right? In so much of our country is totally underfunded, completely failing right now. We have districts, right, that are paying parents to drive their kids so that they can opt out of the bus system. Seattle, offers busing for some kids. My kid is one of those kids. But, it doesn't make sense. Like the bus, like we're all within walking distance of transit where this bus serves. But the kids, they're not encouraged to ride transit in elementary school, right? And even if they just had bus monitors on there, I'd be happy to put my kid on a public bus, even in kindergarten, right? Rather than creating this whole separate system that requires a lot of extra drivers, often is running diesel buses, takes these really circuitous routes that don't make any sense. Yeah, I feel like there's so much potential there if we were actually willing to say, okay, our priority is going to be building out a robust public transit system and trying to have as many people use it as we can.
And I think also it's kind of like a funnel where like I remember where I grew up, because we didn't have any buses, and so I had never been exposed to public transportation. I didn't really even know it was an option, and so I just kind of just kept driving because it was just what I always knew. And it kind of took a while for me to even like explore taking public transit because I had just never been exposed to it. And so I feel like, having kids have the ability to take it also lets them know it exists. And when they get older, they know how important it is as well.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, one thing we do have here in Washington State is one of our few sort of statewide victories recently was free transit for everyone under the age of 18, which I think is encouraging more kids to ride transit, but not all kids. The last couple of summers, not this summer, but the previous two, taught like our state runs a summer camp for high school students. It's run by the state DOT, and it's like a transportation summer camp. And I push really hard to have like a sidewalks and accessibility, walk transit ride along. And most of the kids in the Seattle area who were participating had never been on a bus in Seattle, right? And many of them had never been on the light rail. And it was kind of mind blowing to me that you could grow up in this region, right? And with free transit, and that just, because it's not what their parents are doing, and there's, stereotypes about transit in dangerous situations that many of these kids are just not exposed to that at all.
Yeah, it's very unfortunate. So I wanted to maybe shift gears a little bit here and talk about maybe your thoughts on COVID and especially long COVID. I feel like I actually know a few people in my life who have some pretty bad symptoms from like long COVID and like feeling like they can't really walk a lot anymore and I feel like that's really kind of a form of like disability, and it's becoming a lot more common with long COVID. Um, do you have any thoughts on kind of how that plays into this whole accessibility?
Yeah, and I know people as well who have experienced that and experienced chronic fatigue issues as well, COVID and not COVID related. And I think there is, when someone experiences something in their life that changes, the way they're able to access the world, it's really traumatic, right? And people then I think have a chance to get really mobilized, which the sort of the positive thing from this is that more people are getting connected to the disability community and getting connected to understanding accessibility and understanding what it means to fight for accessible communities. So those pieces are important, and I think we there is this sort of when I grew up, and I grew up before the ADA, right? Like, you don't talk about disability, right? There's so much stigma around disability and stigma and identifying as disabled that there was, so much pushback about even publicly admitting that you didn't have the same ability as what is like considered to be normal, right? And so, like, for me growing up, everything was about like trying to pretend I could see things that I couldn't see, and trying to act normal and trying to look normal, and like even like not wearing my glasses even though it made it worse. Just so I looked more like not even wearing glasses, right? Like not and so and that has changed, I think, since in the 90s, part of the ADA, working with younger people who grew up, born after the ADA, or went to school after that, like a much deeper sense of pride and sort of less shame around disability. And I hope, that trajectory continues, where it can be more, that it is more, people understand that there's a whole bunch of different ways to, exist in the world, and many kinds of disabilities, visible and not visible, that are out there, and that there doesn't need to be shame or stigma around that, and that we can be really, we can publicly talk about that and publicly talk about our access needs, and also recognize that, that there's lots of other factors that figure into the way we interact with the world, whether that's race or income or gender, whether we're caregivers, right, our age, right, all those pieces also play into sort of that dynamic.
Yeah, and I think the age piece is also really interesting. Like, feel like we're definitely at a time where the number of people who are aging out of driving, you kind of mentioned this in your book, is just it's very, very high. And I feel like that's also such an important, constituency. I mean, like, I feel like when I, get to that point in my life, I want to know that there's, a place where I can still go get my groceries, I can still go see my friends, and still, use the world without having to drive.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot when my parents are sort of at the place where they're still driving, but they can't drive at night anymore very well. They actually came and visited me today in Seattle and had to drive home, 2 hours. I grew up outside of the city, outside of in the woods, and I start to worry about them more and more. And I think about my grandparents too, who my grandfathers both passed away before I was born, but both my grandmas aged out of driving, interestingly and differently. One of them lived in a rural area in southern Indiana. She lived on a farm. She had lots of animals. She developed a heart condition that caused her to pass out unexpectedly, but she did not want to stop driving because she didn't want to have to be moved into a nursing home, right? Which is where she would have had to go if she couldn't drive. And she didn't want to give up her animals and her farm. And so she decided to keep on driving, and she kept on driving and would periodically, pass out, and we would hear about so and so found her on the side of the road in her Suburban, and luckily she always just kind of drove into the ditch and never hurt anyone. But she just kept driving until she passed away finally in her sleep peacefully, and that was good. But really not an ideal situation for her, and if she'd hurt or killed someone else, it would have been horrible. My other grandma had developed an eye condition, couldn't drive anymore, and she spent the last 30 of her years, she was in Long Island, and then spent the last 30 years of her life living in Honolulu in Hawaii, and very intentionally sort of set up her life in a way where she lived in an apartment tower. She didn't have to drive anywhere. She could walk to the grocery store. I remember, as a kid, there was a Taco Bell on the first floor, which was like all I thought you needed to live on. And that's sort of, while I think there's a lot, that can be done to support folks living in rural areas, like my grandma didn't, tap into the sort of resources that she could have to stay and not drive. Like what the world I imagine for myself, as a non-driver is really more like I want to be in a place where I can get my needs met and not have to rely on other people, and not have to rely on volunteer drivers, right? And be able to, walk or bike or take transit to where I need to go.
Yeah, and I feel like it's it's kind of sad that a lot of times really the only options are like you go into a nursing home, or like I mean, I guess that's really the only option unless you want to, yeah, keep driving even though it's unsafe. Like that's just very unfortunate.
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, it's such a difficult choice too. And it's not a choice for some folks, like say, you can't afford, to have groceries delivered, or perhaps you would like to move into a city, right? That where you don't have to drive, but housing costs in the city are, 5 times what you're paying in the more rural area that you live in, where you perhaps, own a home. And so like, that is also a big piece too, is that, for folks who perhaps are living in a rural area and want to make that shift, it's just not possible because of the cost of housing in transit-rich areas.
It's very, very unfortunate. You kind of mentioned how you don't like relying on like volunteer drivers. I was wondering, like I feel like sometimes on like buses or trains, the system is accessible in the sense that like you can get on the train if you have a wheelchair or reduced mobility, but it's kind of an involved process where like the driver has to get out and maybe help you and maybe extend a ramp, or it's a bit of an inconvenient accessibility. Do you have any thoughts on that? And maybe should we be working towards like convenient accessibility?
Yeah, I mean, I think like, for ramps, roll on, roll off, like, level boarding, right? Like you have on some bus systems, and light rail is great. But I also think that we need as a community to be more patient, right? And recognize that like there is often so much frustration when someone with a wheelchair wants to get on, and right, oh my gosh, it's going to take so long, and like, oh gosh, and it's like, no, this is part of our experience as being in community with people with different needs, right? It's fine. It's like a minute, maybe it's 2 minutes. Like it's not going to make the difference in your day. And so, being more patient and not viewing that as, yeah, as like, not viewing that as something that you're placing on, blame on the person with the disability for slowing you down. Because I think that does, that attitude is so prevalent too. And it makes it hard, right, for people then who are wheelchair users. Some of my friends who I've talked to about this experience, like, nobody likes to feel like they are getting stares when they get on the bus, right? So, having that sort of, okay, it's fine if the driver, needs to go back and help someone get secured, right? It's going to be okay. But ultimately, yeah, especially if it's high volume systems, like building that, roll on, roll off can be great if it lines up and there's no big gap.
That's always the expensive part. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like there's so many different types of disabilities as well. Like there may be people who need a wheelchair, or vision disabilities, or the heart condition as your grandmother had. How do we work towards like universal accessibility for all of these different types of a disability?
Yeah, that's a great question. I I guess like my sort of academic background, I struggle with the term universal because I really do think that like um there is there are so many different kinds of access needs, right? And sometimes they're conflicting. And um inevitably like there are going to be trade-offs like no matter what. And so we can, aim for systems that meet as many access needs as possible. But I also think sometimes we just need systems, multiple entry points, like multiple systems, perhaps multiple ways of accessing information, multiple ways of getting places, right? And in some ways, that's like what's going to create resilient systems, because maybe one system breaks down and another one can still work, or one system can work for someone and another one can't. So yeah, that's sort of how I've been when I think about sort of access, it's more like how many different entry points can we create versus one system that can meet everyone's needs.
That's a really interesting point. And I feel like much that like, curb ramps originally for like wheelchair users, but they end up helping a lot of people, if you have a stroller or even just luggage. I feel like that redundancy also helps. If one entrance is maybe needs repairs, or there's benefits for everyone in that resiliency as well.
Yep, totally. Yeah. And yeah, and things we don't even think about, right, that people wouldn't even anticipate being something they would use, right? I mean, you think about captions, oh my gosh, right? And the deaf community fought like hell for that, on TV, and now look, we're all so reliant on captions. Even me with low vision, like I find myself finding them super useful when I'm having a hard time processing the audio. So yeah, lots of ways it can benefit us. And I think, again, like there are so many different kinds of experiences of disability. Like every time I'm doing a book talk at a new place, I feel like people will come up to me and share their experiences of not being able to drive. And almost every time there's a new sort of situation, a new type of disability, a new sort of way of experiencing the world that I hadn't thought about. And so, I do think also just trying to make sure that we get as many of those experiences in the room, in, people with disabilities working at transit agencies, working in transportation departments, working in government, teaching at planning schools, teaching in engineering schools, right? Like, because a lot of those perspectives aren't there. And then it just becomes like, oh, there's this like this the way the world works, it works for everyone because the people who are there, it's working for them, and that's not the way it is.
Yeah, and I feel like that's so important just because like I think even someone with the best of intentions, like like myself, I would consider myself like able-bodied, and I would like to advocate for better transit, but I just even if I wanted to, I could not like think about all of these situations and all the different levels of ability and all the different like accommodations that might be needed. And so yeah, I feel like you're so right that that lived experience, having people in the room, that's the most important.
Yep. Yeah. And recognizing that, one disabled person, just because I'm low vision doesn't mean that I understand what it's like to be, have a different experience of disability, right? And so while I may be more in touch with other parts of the disability community because I, am connected to it, that also is, I can't speak for everyone, and it takes work to make those connections. And so being also recognizing that as well.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, sorry, switching gears a little bit, again, so where, kind of looking towards the future, where do you think we'll be in 20 years, when the book, when driving is not an option, when that's the best-selling book of all time, and everybody has agreed that accessibility is the most important thing, where do you think we'll be looking at?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I do think we are going to see denser and denser cities. And I think driving is going to be a less convenient choice. My hope is, right, for many of our trips, just because of that increase in density. Um, and so I hope I hope that more places are like in North America are like New York, or like, Montreal or Vancouver or Ottawa. I don't know. There's a lot of Canadian cities that I think have done a lot more on density than we have here in the States, and transit access. But how can we have communities, that where people can afford to live, where low income and working class people can afford to live, where you don't need to have a car and you could have equivalent mobility. That's sort of my hope, my dream. Um, yeah, I mean, in 20 years, gosh, my kid will be, 25. And so he has the same eye condition I do. And I have hesitated raising him in Seattle. I'm here because that's where my family is, and I wanted that family support when he was little. But, as he becomes a teenager and he can't drive, like I want a world to feel like it's normal for him not to drive. And that wasn't my experience in Washington State. And so I'm really hoping in, 10, 15, 20 years that it will be more normal not to drive, even in big West Coast, big, new sprawling Western cities.
Yeah, and I feel like, thanks to your work, I feel like Seattle is, in Washington State, it seems like, at least from the stories in the book, it seems like it's working in that direction. And I mean, I visited Seattle not too long ago, and the light rail system, which they built out, I mean, very recently, is pretty
Yeah,
incredible.
finally. But yes, it's good. It's good. It's growing. So yeah.
Yeah.
And the grass is always greener, right? Like, or where you go to a place, you're like, oh man, they've got it figured out here. And, my city. But yeah, no, there's some hopeful things. We also have a mayoral election happening this fall, and there's a really great candidate who's actually president of the Transit Riders Union here, who came out first in the primary in August. And so she has a real chance of winning, and that would be huge for our city. So I'm excited about that.
Now that would be awesome.
Yeah.
So do you kind of feel like we're headed, I mean, you're more hopeful than kind of not hopeful. You think we're headed in the right direction?
I mean, big picture right now. I don't know. I don't know if more hopeful is, but I do think like I couldn't do this work if I didn't think it was possible, to change things and to head thing, to make a difference and actually to be heading in a positive direction, right? So, I think I have to be hopeful.
I think, yeah, that's where I kind of have to keep my head. Yeah, you wouldn't do it if you didn't think things could be better.
Yeah.
Oh, all right. Well, I think that's about all my questions. So thank you very much for all the time here. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Great conversation. Great questions.
Yeah, and we've got a lot of great questions in the chat. So I'm gonna read off a couple of them. So we have one from Max, and for other folks, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. Um, so we have a question from Max about saying, how do we elevate youth in the conversation that they seem to be discounted or given lip service to in their locality in San Mateo when they show up at public comment, which I forget if it's in your book or a past conversation we've had where there's like, it's one thing to hear it and we don't want to be cute. It's like, oh, this isn't the pat on the head. Thank you for coming out, people like youth or people with disability. How do we center that more or elevate that more?
Yeah, and I feel like this is a question we should ask youth. I'm actually really excited. I'm going to Hawaii next week, and I know that there's a group of youth climate activists there, right, who have sued the state around climate action. And I feel like that there are groups out there of young people doing really exciting climate and transportation work. And I think oftentimes with any sort of space, it probably means those of us who are a little older, like stepping aside more often and creating space and,
Mhm.
stepping back like any sort of power sharing. And so I guess maybe that's on us to make sure that we create that space for them. I was on this panel I was on in Canada last week in Edmonton. Actually, there was a 14-year-old. I asked them to sort of pull together some folks with different non-driver experiences. And, I do this normally, and usually I get, a disabled person and a senior and like someone from the community of recent immigrants, right? And this time they brought a 14-year-old too. And it was so cool. I mean, this 14-year-old, Abdul Qadir, was incredibly poised for a 14-year-old. I was not that together at 14, but it was so great to have his voice as part of this. And so, yeah, I would encourage you, if you're doing a panel with transit riders or non-drivers, like bring in some young folks, take the time to recruit. And they do have a lot, obviously, to share. And so, it's about creating that space. I think that's what we can do.
And I think to that point about like elevating it and kind of, as you said, like kind of politically mobilizing, so there's more of that bite to it, that it's like, it's not, hey, politicians, you should do this because it's nice. It's, hey, politicians, you should do this because your careers, adding that, I think that little and I think to your point also about people who've been around the block kind of stepping back or stepping out. Transbay Coalition, we are a very volunteer centric type of group. And there's definitely times where you just kind of pass the ball to someone, say, hey, catch, here you go. And trusting means they're going to do it differently than you. And that's part of it. So we have this great question from Mikey, who said that your conversation with TWOC inspired him to firsthand to join transit and pedestrian advocacy. So props to you on that already. So as an involuntary non-driver, Mikey said that they have found wonderful camaraderie amongst fellow mobility advocates. They're also experiencing financial stress with tech layoffs and finding work tough while disabled more broadly. So as much as they love advocacy, it's hard to balance time between what they love and what needs to be done. And so what recommendations do you have for Mikey and fellow disabled advocates, disabled transit advocates, who are trying to kind of make this more self-sustaining?
Yeah, no, I hear that. I mean, I've been a non-driver my whole life, and I was interested in transportation stuff in New York, and in particular, like all the pedestrian deaths that were happening. And we had really high pedestrian deaths in like the 2010, 2011, 2013, 2014, like that era. And I got really involved as a volunteer, well, not really involved, as involved as I could, right? And it wasn't my job, and I was still, working full time, doing other stuff. And at a certain point, it just became, right, like it's a struggle when you're really passionate about something. You wish you could get paid to do it sometimes, and you can't. It's not how you put food on the table. And so I hear that, and I think it's fine to not have it, to give what you can, right, and to find the places where you feel supported, you feel it gives you energy. And when it doesn't give you energy, right, then it's not what you have to be doing. Like there's no one has to do this. No one's obligated to do this, even if it, is your lived experience, right? Like you've got to do it in a way that can sustain you. So,
And you got a heart emoji rack from Mikey. And I think also what's so beautifully said, and as part of that, like the work is never done.
No, and it's never done, and it won't be done.
And it won't be done. Yeah,
right?
and it's
no.
And that, at least for me, and I think for others, like you're like, oh, if I pull this all nighter, then tomorrow I could pull that all nighter, and like that's like self-sustaining is more important than the spike of activity. And I think that's kind of, particularly as when people are going from like kind of newer in that space to recognizing like what is the cadence that you could keep type of thing.
Or it's okay to go up and down too, right? Like I'm someone who likes to like be really intense about something and then like not be intense, which is why I'm much better being self-employed.
I feel like maybe on a follow-up day I'll ask you about how does one become not intense. I'm going to shut off the phone and throw it in the ocean. But I think this also,
kids, man, they force you to like not do your I've been reading Harry Potter like 3 hours a day lately, so
that's a big part. Well, and that's also, I think, to the point about like the sheer volume of work, and as you talked about, like this is all happening within the larger context of we aren't starting from a neutral place. It wasn't, that's what's happening in the 90s, and then we hit pause on society, except for we got to do a bunch of work. Society continues to move, which I think connects to our next question from Max about how the current National Transportation Secretary, Sean Duffy, has 6 children. JD Vance has stated that encouraging higher birth rates is a policy priority. And so if we talk about the kind of difficulty of children are joy, then I have to talk about the logistical problem of transportation, of children, of transit, of non-drivers. Is that an opening to bring in that type of conservative into car independent policy making? And do you think anything working that, like, is there anything from the, like, we like kids, what do you got kind of thing?
Yeah, no, I mean, that one's tricky because I have one kid, and part of the reason I don't have more kids is like I couldn't imagine when he was little, like how I would manage 2 kids on, getting on it. And I know people do, but like, the hassle of, a stroller plus a toddler onto a bus, right? Like, and
Well,
another baby, right? Or 2 kids on a bike. Like, there's yeah, I mean, and so I don't have the answers there. I think it is, it is trickier. And part of it is then like older kids need to be able to be independent, right? And like that conversation we had about, allowing older kids to be able to get themselves places without you having to take them everywhere. But younger kids, that piece is hard with active transportation, especially like, if you're in a system with like New York, right, without elevators, and you're schlepping strollers up and
yeah.
down staircases, like that just is so hard, so hard. And the more kids you're trying to do that with, the harder. So yeah.
Well, and I think it's also to that point that I don't actually know, like, there's the saying, um you know uh just because someone might be part of a community doesn't mean that they're advocating for the best interests of that community. And that, I think, to this kind of question, if there was an opening on that, I think we'd also see that with universal childcare or school. Like, there's a lot of other issues that people with kids in theory really need help in. And if having more kids meant you were more prone to supporting that, like, our politics would be different. And I think that's kind of a tough part, because I do see that someone's like, well, you have 6 kids, so you must, your van is a bus, and they're like, well, that's they have other things going on there.
Yeah.
Which actually gets into this other question from Betsy in the Bay. Gets in kind of this, like, to that point of quasi public, kind of not. What do you think about publicly funded ride hail services? That in the Bay Area we have a lot of patchwork. From what we can tell, and there's limited hours, and coverage areas makes them barely usable, and they're really expensive. And so, like, should we
Like
be
this is
trying
like
to?
the on-demand transit, like
Yeah,
via, yeah.
yeah, and I know that there's kind of a spectrum of these. Like, it's not just Uber, Lyft, but like, um, in the Bay Area, the paratransit, I've heard it colloquially called like parastranded, because for those of you who are listening who haven't had the joy of dealing with it, you have to order it a day in advance often. So, how do we help make these better, for the ones where it is, like, to your point about the, like, via these other things, like, is that worth trying to gussy those up, or should we just focus on, like, how do we get people onto the bus? Like, what do you think of?
I mean,
Oh, and sorry, they clarified, like, publicly subsidized Uber is what they're talking about. It's on demand, right?
yeah. I mean, so I think first of all, like paratransit, there's so much generally we could be doing to make paratransit work better for people, and especially with the scheduling tech we have now, like that it can't be more on demand, and is, that's silly. We need to push the people in charge of that to innovate. And I think part of it is we need more disabled paratransit users running transit agencies, or running paratransit, departments within transit agencies, so that, people are going to fight for something that they really use and believe in. And I don't think that's happening enough in our transit agencies, unfortunately. And I think that's because we don't have the right people in the room often. So I think that's part of it. Uber and Lyft, like, my challenge there is, like, if they're not wheelchair accessible, then you are, for the folks who need that wheelchair accessibility, the system that they use becomes even smaller, and like, with if there are wheelchair accessible cabs. So say you're using Uber and Lyft, like publicly funded Uber and Lyft for trips, then the folks who would, well, yeah, anyway, I just like, I think it's complicated with the taxi industry as well, and with wheelchair accessibility and what regulations are there. But I'm generally not a fan of publicly funded private transit systems, and I think Via is also falls into this for me, with with the on-demand piece, especially in places where there is fixed route transit. I really think we need to be building out our fixed route transit networks where there's the density to support them. I live in a neighborhood in Seattle that's had Via since 2018. It is, I mean, it does not say it's no faster than walking, and to the nearest bus stop or train stop, and it but I think it serves people who are afraid of taking public transit, and I think that's an interesting situation that we've gotten ourselves into. So and then it also, getting back to the parent piece, does not serve parents and caregivers of young children, because you have to bring your own car seat. And that, like, no person in their right mind is gonna carry around a 30 or 40-pound car seat with them
Yeah,
and run a
that's
bunch of errands. And
a lot.
and Via and our, like, Via just in this on-demand transit systems, like, they just aren't dealing with that piece of the of the constituency of their riders, right, or potential riders. And so parents, I think, are getting, like, they're just assuming everyone doesn't have a kid, and
Yeah.
that's not true. Like, if you look at the bus routes in our neighborhood, there's a lot of people traveling with 2 and 3-year-olds, right? And like those people can't use Via. So yeah.
Well, and I think we have a couple more questions, and I think as part of that, in the autonomous driving and the Waymo world, like, these companies are really pushing themselves as accessible options. And here in the Bay Area, like, it's in San Francisco, it feels like there are more Waymos in certain neighborhoods than there are human driving cars. Is So they say that they're the magical cure to everything. Do you think that's going to be happening, or
Yeah.
the answer is just wheelchair accessible Waymos and then call it a day?
I mean, it's funny because my colleague, we flew her down to, like, the cruise, like, when they did the rollout of their wheelchair accessible thing, like, 2 years ago or whatever, and then they, promptly went belly up right after that. And she was, there were so many unsolved issues with the vehicle that she pointed out to me, around, like, securement, like, things they just hadn't figured out or thought through well enough to figure out. And so I don't, I think it's really, really a problem to be creating a transportation system that's going to exclude wheelchair users. And they haven't, until that is addressed. Like, I don't even want to have a conversation about it solving transportation.
Yeah.
Right? Like, that to me is really frustrating. I've used them in Phoenix a couple of times. I have to say, I've also been, like, harassed. I had to file a complaint against a Lyft driver for an issue once that was not a great situation. And so the freedom of not having to sort of, like, keep someone else happy in a vehicle, like, it's the first time I'd ever been in a vehicle by myself, and I was like, whoa, this is awesome. And I'm like, okay, but that's the problem. Like, like, I don't want a world where, you have to go everywhere in a vehicle. Like, that is not the universe I want to live in. If it's going to be easy for rich people to use these and middle-class people to use these for all their trips, and we're excluding everyone who needs a wheelchair, and we're excluding everyone who can't afford that, that's not the world I want to live in. So yeah.
Well, and I think and I think that, to your point about, like, the person and the people involved, like, that is in many ways the drawback and also a big advantage to public transit. There is a visually impaired person I organize with occasionally, and they say a nice thing about a bus driver is they'll say, hey, there's the sidewalk's broken over there, just, like, watch out, or like, just life happens. And it's very nice to have a human just say, hey, let me talk to you about this. And we have, and I think one thing that you're doing a great job with about how do we really push this is the week without driving, which is, getting bigger and bigger in Sonoma County in the northern part of the Bay Area. There's a big petition to basically, rather than saying, hey, individuals take the pledge, there's a petition for individuals to sign telling elected officials to take the pledge.
Oh, cool.
Awesome. Because there's a little experimentation, and some people have responded very negatively to that request, like that. And so what are you seeing, what are ways that are helping drum up Week Without Driving support? Like how are you getting people to take that pledge? Like what's working and maybe what's not working? Like because you're
Mm.
as kind of the center
Yeah,
of
I
that
mean,
hub,
I'm
you get
having
all
these
sorts of stuff. Yeah.
conversations, yeah, right now around sort of our Week Without Driving planning, because I think we've been sort of just trying everything for the last couple of years, and funding landscapes are changing, and so we might need to be a bit more strategic about what we are trying and what we're not trying, and so I do think a lot of, I mean, what is exciting to me about it is how it's really driven by local groups, and local groups, as
Mhm.
long as they're sort of continuing to center this about access for non-drivers, like that's kind of the only thing that we care about,
Mhm.
right, on a messaging front. And so people can take it and run with it, right? And it's been really cool to see the different things communities have tried and done. And I think
Mhm.
so that piece to me is how groups really own it locally. Like that is the awesome piece of it.
Yeah.
And so how to support that? We did a bunch of mini grants this year, and I think provided a little bit of extra funding for local groups. I'm really
Mhm.
excited to see what comes from that and what sort of report backs we get. And I think from a national perspective, maybe that's what we put our energy into the future is bringing getting that funding then so that it can be distributed out, and getting other sort of sponsorships so that we can get a little bit of extra support for local groups who want to try things.
Yeah. It's been interesting in Sonoma County where it's a predominantly rural county, some semi-dense cities and or kind of large suburbs, depending on how you're counting it. If you're rounding up or rounding down, and like beautiful places, and like to even ask a politician to do it, regardless of whether or not they're going to say yes, like to even, I think one thing that I love about Week Without Driving, and why I think it's such a brilliant idea of yours, is that even if someone does have the visceral reaction of no, I'm not doing that, that you're like,
Mhm.
great, but like and why is that? Like it's really,
Yeah. Yeah.
you really hit
And
the
I
nail.
think, I mean, what makes it even more powerful, and this takes a lot of work, is like, here's a constituent, your constituent who lives pretty near you and they can't drive. How
Yeah,
about you talk to them about what, could work better for them in your community, right? And like,
yeah.
that piece of the organizing as well, because I think it's harder for someone to say, no, I can't do this if, their constituents that are doing it because they don't have a choice.
Who could possibly do such a thing? It's like
Yes. Yeah.
Anna is, that person is.
Yeah.
Well, it's really great, and I think one also, just as we wrap up, a kind of a small logistical question. Um, I believe on a lot of paratransits, you actually, someone was like, "Oh, how do we get politicians to try paratransit?" And it
Mm,
was a very long, "Oh, well, they have to set up an account, they have to be a
yeah.
registered caregiver." Like it was. Do you think there's any hope of getting the paratransit operators to be a little flexible on that, or is that all
Yeah, we're
federal?
actually doing that for the first time here in Washington State this year. I don't know if other places could have done it already, and I don't know. The universe is so big, a Week Without Driving activities, but we are doing 2 paratransit ride-alongs where we got the transit agency to say yes, and then we
Mhm.
identified, a paratransit rider who said yes, and then we're pulling elected leaders into that
Nice.
paratransit ride-along. So it's just for, a couple of key electeds because the vehicles are only so big, but um, yeah, we'll see how it goes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and maybe that adds a little exclusivity. It's like, oh, well, not every city council member gets this, only the mayor
Yeah.
decides.
Though it's so funny in scheduling it, the city council members are like, "Oh, I don't have time," And you're like,
Yeah.
"Oh, well, that's how long paratransit takes to get from there
Yeah.
to there."
I can't wait. It's like,
So, yeah.
yeah. Well, in good news, when we'll do our report back, Assembly member, I'm getting word that Assembly member Damon Connolly in the North Bay is taking the pledge. So I don't know in terms of other state assembly member, that's a pretty
Cool.
big one. We're very excited about
Yeah.
that.
Awesome.
Yeah, well, and thank you so much. It's 7 o'clock. I want to be respectful of your time, and
Yeah, I gotta go put a kid to sleep. So, yep.
thank you. And
Yeah.
for everyone who's been tuning in, we'll send out the recording and the discount code for the book. The book is great. It's a really easy read. Also, I think I did it in like a single sitting. Um, and especially if you're waiting for the bus, it's a great read. And it's a cool, it's I think it's one of those things where there's a lot of stuff where you're like, oh, and I think for people who are coming from, who are come from a disability experience, like, I think there's a lot of like, you're like, yeah, yes, this is nice to see and very affirming. And I think for folks who are not yet disabled or temporarily able-bodied, there's just a lot of these moments where, as you said, like, does the ramp meet the sidewalk? Does this make it? There's just 1,000 of those things, and the book does such a great job highlighting them all. There's so much about rural communities in the book that we didn't get into in the conversation. So it's a really amazing read. So you get 30% off with the discount code webinar. The links in the chat. And yeah, I'll pass it to Dylan to close us out.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much for the discussion, and it was great chatting with you after reading the book. Yeah, thanks so much.
Great. Yeah, thank you both. Have a great night, everyone.
There we go.
Take
Good luck
care.
with Week Without Driving, everybody.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.